What we're really going to talk about is the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act that was passed in the spring of 2010. So we're already in this thing, 5 years on March of this year and heading into 6 years already. And as we knew when that legislation was passed, we were moving into a circumstance where there was phase-ins of requirements under that tax bill which would affect businesses and employees for a substantial period of time. Today's presentation is going to take a look at primarily the requirements, the shared responsibility payment requirements that are basically being imposed upon employers that are qualifying employers, and we'll talk about that for the year 2015, meaning that there are filings that are going to be required with potential penalty assessments as of next spring. So the returns are going to have to be filed by year end, or not by year end, but in the spring of 2016 for 2015 information. What you'll find as we go through these provisions is they're very arcane. Okay, they're not difficult to understand in and of themselves because they're just a specific set of numerical mechanical rules, and you need to be familiar with them to be able to do the calculations. But what it does do is it's an administrative nightmare. And I was speaking to a gentleman at lunchtime who was talking about his employer with 800 employees, and envision that as we go through this program. I mean, here's a person, chief financial officer of an 800 employee company. He has these mandates inflicted by this Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act that he has to comply with. And the issue then for him, of course, for you, if you're in a similar situation, is how do you get this done within the guise of the rules and in compliance with the mandates that are coming out of not only the legislation that was passed, but interpretive rules and rev procs and rev procedures that have come along the pike since that date. So let's talk a little bit about some of the overriding theories, some of the things that we're going to talk about. The first is this requirement that all employers under the Affordable Care Act are required to provide health benefits. That's not absolutely true. So the rules itself, the ACA, and we'll refer to the Affordable Care Act as just that, doesn't absolutely require in certain circumstances that employers provide these health benefits. Large employees, however, they're kind of stuck, and we'll get into what is a large employee and how that's going to work in conjunction with this. If you don't make affordable coverage available, then you're going to have an employer shared responsibility payment that has to be made. As I just mentioned a moment ago, the reporting requirements are actually due to come into vogue in January 1st of 2015. The filings will be in 2016. There's also, if time permits, there's this requirement that we pay an excise tax on certain Cadillac-type health insurance plans. And we'll talk about that. That's not intended to take effect in the current year, but it gets a lot of media attention, so I wanted to at least touch on it if we have time, so you folks, when you go out into your businesses and back out into the world, you have kind of a sense at least what they're talking about then. And when we get to the end, we do want to spend a few minutes talking about some of the challenges and some of the opportunities for smaller businesses. And when we talk about smaller businesses, we're essentially talking about businesses that are not subject to the employer's shared responsibility rules as we go through. So we're going to kind of teamwork this, Rebekah and myself, and go through these provisions. So in general, what is the rule? Well, you'll find, I think, first and foremost, this is as I said, numerical mechanical process, but it's predicated upon understanding the variables into the formulas and the equations and the mechanics itself. So it's really a law about definitions. And understanding what definitions mean is how you come to understand how this law is going to be put into place and how it's going to be working throughout the system. So in general, we're looking at applicable large employers, and we'll talk about who they are in just a moment. But they are basically going to be, substantively facing severe penalties for not offering health care coverage that meets certain requirements. That word certain requirements is too much of a generality here, but we'll explain exactly what type of requirements are being imposed on those employers. And it has to be offered to full-time employees. So it is effective, as I said, for years beginning on January 1st, 2015. And there is a threshold in the definition. So we're going to talk about applicable large employers. We'll go through the definition in the next slide first and come back to the transition relief issue here. And an applicable large employer, who is that specifically? And again, we're only talking this afternoon in the limited time we have with respect to the employer side of this law. So an applicable large employer is someone who is measured on employee count, okay? And we're basically talking about 50 or more full-time employees or full-time equivalent employees. So it's a little bit of a definitional mess there as well. You have to get into understanding who they are. But basically, you're looking at the average number of employees and their hours of service in the business days during the prior calendar year, and that's what's going to basically determine any employer's ALE status for the following year, ALE being applicable large employer. So these rules do apply to groups with common ownership. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But understand that when we're talking about 50 or more full-time employers, there's a transition relief.
Right. The transition relief is for 2015, entities that had between 50 and 99 employers were not subject to these shared responsibility payments. They are still subject to reporting requirements, which we'll get into in just a little bit. But that's the transition relief that's referred to and that you may be aware of. And also, as Bob mentioned, the employee count is determined as of the previous calendar year. So for 2015, we'd be looking at 2014. Any employers who were subject to these shared responsibility payments would have already done their counts or should have already done their counts based on 2014 employment levels. So going into 2016, we're going to be looking at 2015, the current year employee counts.
Yeah, so where do you start? Well, obviously, if that's the definition, 50 or more employees, then again, you have to look at the definition of employee. So really what we're talking about then is anybody who is performing a service for the entity, the enterprise that's possibly subjected to the penalties and the shared responsibility or the shared payment responsibility requirements. If that entity controls what will be done by that person and how it will be done. So it controls what and how. Now really, that's at the core of most of the revenue procedures and revenue rulings that are out there over an expanded history of time with the Internal Revenue Service that discusses the classification of an employee versus an independent contractor. And control and instruction or direction of an individual is always basically pulled into that. Essentially what you're talking about is the same definitions that you see for other provisions of employee classification, driving primarily off of a common law definition. So that's how it starts. Then you have to look at the hours requirements because the issue, again, is 50 full-time or full-time equivalents, right? So what is a full-time employee? Well, according to President Obama, it's 30 hours a week. So that's the threshold which comes through in the legislation. So the legislation imposes this requirement, and you have an alternative. It's 30 hours per week or 130 hours per month. So you have an either or there on how you cumulatively get to that number. The other part of it is consideration, if you will, as an employer of how many full-time equivalents do you have. And that's another test. So a full-time equivalent is anybody that works for the company as an employee, meets those common law tests, but yet has not been taken into account as a full-time employee. So if they don't meet the 30-130 test, 30 or 130 test, then they're a employee that gets considered in the calculation of the FTEs, okay? This is fraught with acronyms, so we'll try to make sure we don't overdo it. So full-time equivalent employee, as I said, is any and all other employees other than the full-times. And then there's some specific, by exclusion, by statute, exclusionary provisions that exclude the list that you see on the slide: sole proprietors, partners, greater than 2% S-corp shareholders, real estate agents, direct sellers, and independent contractors. So that would go within reason. Most of those people have a classification for other purposes within the Internal Revenue Code that basically pull them out of that specific provision as it relates to employee status. Now, to move on beyond that, then you start to say, well, okay, we know we have 30 full-time employees, we have 60 other employees. Well, how do we calculate those others to determine exactly what the amount of the full-time equivalent is And that's a test that Rebekah will go over with you.
So to determine the full-time equivalent employees, again, this is anybody who doesn't meet that 30 hours per week or 130 hours per month. We look at these part-time employees and on a monthly calculation take their aggregate number of hours for all of the employees and divide that total by a maximum of 120 hours. So again, there's a bit of a discrepancy there between this 130 hour for full-time versus this maximum 120 hour that goes into the calculation for to determine part-time or full-time equivalents. So for example, if we have 10 part-time employees who are working in a month and each one has 100 hours of service, we have 1,000 hours combined total for the month that these employees are working, these non-full-time employees. So dividing that number by 120 maximum hours, we get 8.3 employees, and that would give us our number of full-time employee equivalents for that month. And I wanted to stress here that this calculation is only used to determine ALE, applicable large employer status. This calculation is not used in determining any kind of an employee count or a full-time equivalent employee count for the shared responsibility payments. This just helps us to decide if we're an ALE or not an ALE. And then we're also able to exclude seasonal employees. So those employees who are generally working 6 months or less during the year on a seasonal basis are excluded from the calculation.
Yeah, so that's just one aspect of this, of course, as Rebekah points out, to express a conclusion of whether or not your company is a qualifying or an applicable large employer that's going to get into one of these circumstances where shared responsibility is an obligation. You can see just from that simple calculation that it adds a lot to the work if you're going to be doing this by employee, especially when you get in a situation where you have 800 employees. I mean, there's no question you're going to get into that. So the steps basically to determine ALE status is you're going to start by looking at the number of full-time employees for each calendar month in the prior year. That's another interesting aspect of the provisions in the ACA is that the calculations of how many full-time equivalents and full-time employees you have for meeting the LAE test is done on a month-by-month basis. So you're going to do it for each calendar month of the prior year. So for 15's obligations, you have to have gone back to 14. Then you calculate the number of full-time equivalents for each month in the prior year. So it's not an average over the year, it's the actual for each particular month that you're there as well. So again, when you think of it in the context of the gentleman I was talking to with 800 employees, think of the administration that goes into that. Then you have to add the number of full-time and full-time equivalent employees for each month in the calendar year, in the prior year. And then you combine the 12 monthly total and divide by 12. So you're not going to average it. It sounds like, well, gee, at the end, you're just simply doing an average anyway, but it's not exactly the mechanics that they're looking for. They want to see an actual test all the way along. And if you get to that point where you've combined the 12 monthly counts and divided by the 12, one digit for each month, of course, you have to look at the resulting answer, and if you have 50 or more, you're in. Okay, so then you move into the shared responsibility guys. And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about the mechanics of trying to put this together. So we have a couple of tests to take, or a couple of examples which will show you how this works and give you kind of an idea, of the mechanics of exactly how this works.
All right, so I'm just going to give a run through of this example. We have a company that has 40 full-time employees during their calendar year 16. So because we're looking at calendar year 16, these would be, we're trying to determine if this employer is an ALE for 2017. So this company also has 20 part-time employees or non-full-time employees, those that don't meet the 30-hour per week or 130-hour per month tests. And those 20 part-time each have 60 hours per month. So we're going to be looking here at 1,200 hours of service that those part-time employees have per month. Divide by 120, that non-full-time employee limit, and it brings us to 10 full-time equivalent employees for 2016. So combining that 10 full-time equivalent employees with the 40 full-time employees that the company also has, yields 50 in this third point here. It gives us 50 employees for each calendar month of 2016, which means that for 2017, the company is determined to be an applicable large employer.
Which will be applicable, as she said, for 2017 because it's based on 2016 data. You're always on a year lag in determining whether you have this qualification status as an ALE. Confused yet? You know, the sad thing is we really can't run. There's nowhere to go, so we're stuck. Let's look at an example if you're not an ALE, because it kind of gives you a kind of a contrast issue. Remember in the example that Rebekah just went over, the count is 50. That's what we're looking for. This company only has 40 full-time employees and 20 part-time employees, but they are able to get to the 50 threshold by virtue of the mechanics. Now, in the next example, it's a little bit different. Here we have 40 full-time employees for each calendar year, and we also have 15 part-time employees. So instead of having 20 as put out in her example, we have 5 fewer in this, each with 60 hours or less of service. So the first thing we know is we look at every one of these 15 employees this month, and we know that they don't have over 120 hours. That's the first threshold, so we can count the entire 60 in the calculation. If you combine the hours for the 15 employees, you're going to come up with a total of 900, which is simply the 15 employees times the 60 hours that they're working. Then you divide the combined hours of service of the part-time employees by 120, which is the limitation, of course. That equals 7.5. So 120 being the qualifier to make these part-time people, 120 hours, to make them qualify as a single FTE. So here we have 7.5 additional full-time equivalent employees in the calculation, which is simply the 900 by the 120. So the number 7.5, as the slide points out, that's the number of FTEs in this particular calculation. So you add up the total number of full-time employees for each month of 2016. That's going to give you a total of 480, 40 people every month times 12 months. Then you're going to total the number of the FTEs, which is the 7.5. You're going to multiply that by 12 as well, because that's the mechanical requirement of the provision. Then you're going to add the two numbers together, and you're simply going to divide that by 12, which equals 47.5. You can round that to 47. And so the company that has 55 employees in total, 40 full-time and 15 part-time, ends up finding out that they are not a applicable large employer for purposes of the shared responsibility payments. And that's the outcome of that. Understand this is done every single month. And from now on, it's going to be done every single month for as long as the company exists, as long as this law is in force. So we're going to be doing this every month, going to be doing it now for 16, going to be doing it in January for 17 determinations. And so the key is, as we talk about a little bit later, is going to be administration. There's also a series of aggregation rules that Becca will touch on.
Right. Bob mentioned that the applicable large employee status does apply. We have to apply it on an aggregate basis for combined or controlled groups, related parties. And these controlled groups are as set forth under the code under 414 for other controlled group requirements and definitions. So let's look at this example. If we have a parent corporation owning 100% of two subsidiaries, so X owns Y and Z corporations. X has no employees during the current year, the 15 year, and in every calendar month for 2015, Y has 40 full-time employees and X has 60 full-time employees. And for the ease of the calculation, thankfully, we have no full-time equivalent or no part-time employees that we have to calculate for Y or Z. All three of these corporations are considered to be one large applicable large employee, ALE, and each member is called an ALE member. So for each member, the rules are applied separately for determining whether or not they're subject to the reporting and to the shared responsibility payments. But they are grouped together for looking at how many employees each one has. So X, Y, and Z have a combined total of 100 full-time employees on account of Y and Z's 40 and 60 employees for each month during 2015. So for 2016, they are considered to be an ALE. And then Corporation X is not considered to be an ALE member. It's not subject to the shared responsibility payments at all because it has no employees whatsoever.
Yeah, you shouldn't be surprised at those provisions that have aggregation and controlled group implications because of the anti-discrimination rules that are contained in most of the employee benefit provisions in the code after ERISA and the 86 and 84 tax acts. But, nevertheless, keep in mind, it's one more complexity in this because X is probably a holding company, two subs underneath it that are operating with employees. You have that environment where you have an ability to exclude up above from the ALE requirements. Doesn't really matter because they have no employees to provide shared responsibility payments to anyway. And the crux of the consolidated rules down below or the combined rules below in conjunction with aggregation is simply to make sure that everybody's treated equally within a controlled group of corporations, thus, getting over the anti-discrimination requirements.
So on a standalone basis, this corporation Y with 40 full-time employees is not considered to be an ALE, but because it's combined with its related members, it's thrown into the ALE member status.
So let's talk a little bit about what shared responsibility payments are.
So if we've determined that we are an applicable large employer for the current or the preceding subsequent tax year, we have to meet several requirements as an employer in order to not be subject to these shared responsibility payments, which are the penalties that are imposed under the ACA for not providing certain health care that meets these certain requirements. So let's look at what these scenarios are. If an employer does offer coverage, but it offers coverage to fewer than 95% of its employee full-time population, and one of those employees goes out to a marketplace exchange, whether that's a state or a federal exchange, because that one employee went out to get insurance through an exchange, the employer is subject to a penalty for not providing coverage to at least 95% of their employee base. For 2015, part of the transition relief is that number was dropped to 70% of the employee base. But starting 1/1/16, it does go back up to 95% as originally written in the rules.
Keep in mind, again, that we're not addressing the employee side of this today, but if you have 800 employees and you have only one of those 800 that get that premium tax credit by going through one of the national or state exchanges, I guess they're all state exchanges, excuse me, you're going to end up in an environment where you're going to be subject to those rules and possibly the penalties.
So that was the first scenario under which a penalty may apply. And then the second scenario where an employer might be subject to a penalty is if they do offer coverage to at least 95% or 70% for this 2015 year to their employee base, but that coverage is considered to not be affordable or not meet minimum value requirements, and an employee goes out to an exchange and receives a subsidized health care plan. So again, it could be that there's an employer who, kind of plays the game here and does not offer the required coverage and wouldn't be caught if none of their employees go out and gets a subsidized plan under an exchange program. But the likelihood of that, could be very small. As long as you have just one employee that goes out, you could be subject. An employer could be subject to the penalties. So that coverage is deemed either not offered, is unaffordable, or doesn't provide minimum value, which I'm going to define right now.
Yeah, again, a question of definitions. So when they talk about affordability, that's something you have to understand as the employer, or minimum value, or essential minimum value is what they call within the provisions. You have to obviously have a sense of what the definitions are there. It's mostly, again, an understanding of definitions and mechanics.
So the affordability test is met if the employer offers coverage to its full-time employees that is not greater than that the cost of that plan to the employee is not greater than 9.5% of that employee's household income, Well, so how do we figure that out? Is everybody going to be, submitting tax returns or submitting some kind of forms to share to your employer so they can determine this? Thankfully, no, but it's still onerous, and it's still imposed upon the employer to meet these 9.5% of their employees' household income levels. So this level is imposed on household income, 9.5% of household income for self-only coverage. And I think a key here is that even if the employee does need family coverage, that threshold is still only based on self-only coverage. And just a little side note here that if an employee's family members have to go out to an exchange to buy health care coverage for their dependents, for the other members of the household, they are not eligible to receive subsidized care or credit, any kind of premium tax credit, because the employer is still deemed to have offered affordable coverage, even though it's, since it's based on a self-only plan. So it's, it meets the law, but it really doesn't help the family in buying their health care coverage, even if a family plan is not affordable through the employer. There are 3 safe harbors that the IRS or that this Health Care Act allows in order to calculate affordability. They are all optional. The employer does not have to use one of these methods, but they could yield some different levels of employee contribution depending on the different safe harbor used. The first one, is the W-2 safe harbor. If the coverage does not exceed, or if the cost of the coverage to the employee does not exceed 9.5% of the box 1 wages of the W-2. The second is the rate of pay safe harbor. If the employee's monthly, based on the employee's monthly rate of pay, if that amount is not 9.5% of the monthly rate of pay for full-time employees, that's 130 hours by their lowest rate of pay. For hourly employees, it's 130 hours multiplied by their lowest rate of pay. And then for full-time employees, it's that amount is 9.5% of their monthly salary as of the beginning of the healthcare plan year. And then the third safe harbor here is that the cost doesn't exceed 9.5% of the federal poverty line that's in effect 6 months prior to the start of the plan year. So again, there are quite a few dates and calculations required. If an employer chooses to use one of these methods, they can apply that method to their entire employee base, or they can choose different employee bases based on geographic location, based on type of employee. You can apply the different safe harbors to different types of employee groups.
That flexibility is important because you're going to have lower cost employees as rates continue to go up, and it's a never-ending problem, it seems, for all of us, including our firm, that you're going to have to pass more costs on to employees. So having the flexibility of these thresholds and these safe harbors to basically manipulate data to the advantage of the employee group, and manipulate might be a bad word, but basically to fold your planning into these provisions will allow you to basically meet the safe harbors without unduly stressing your employees' incomes for healthcare costs.
And then just briefly, this one has a little bit less definition than the affordability test. This minimum value test is also part of the requirement in qualified healthcare coverage. That the coverage is deemed to provide minimum value, or is deemed to meet the minimum value test if the employer is covering 60% at least of the cost of that plan. So the employee would only be responsible for 40% of the actuarial cost of that plan, whether it's through the premiums, through co-pays, through deductibles, through co-insurance. All those costs don't exceed 40% of the entire cost of the plan to the employee.
So we move on then to basically looking at, the measurement of the full-time employees, the actual physical count. And there's basically 2 definitions, which we know to be is again the 30 hours a week and the 130 hours a month thresholds that we talked about before. Now, it is counted on a monthly-by-monthly basis, or a month-by-month basis, if you will, for each calendar month. And that's really the mechanics of it, no matter what the fiscal year is of the employer or entity, because this is going to have calendar year-end implications. But the rule does provide a couple of safe harbors. The primary one is this look-back safe harbor, where you can set measurement periods and stability periods, meaning that you can go into the historical data, pick some window there, and I'll get into what that window is, use that as a basis for the following year, and put yourself in a position to have some kind of stable period for a number of months without the count. So if you go to the next slide, we're talking about a standard measurement period. And again, definitions. But here, for ongoing employees, the ones that are here month in and month out, we can use the prior 3.5 months. And if we do that, we can use that to calculate the employee hours during that 3.5 month period, and also to determine if ongoing, newly hired, or variable hour employees should be offered coverage at the beginning of the year. Note that if employees are not full-time during this standard measurement period, then they're not required to offer them health insurance for the next period. That's the basis of that. So that's what we're trying to look at, is how best to minimize, if you will, the administrative burden of complying with these rules. The administrative period then is once you have this look-back period and you go through the 3.5 months and you set your standards, if you will, with respect to the employee count over that 3.5 month period, then you have an administrative period which is up to 90 days after the standard measurement period, by which you as the employer have to basically, identify, notify, or enroll eligible full-time employees in the next planned period. So that's an important element, and you have to understand that. Once you've done that, once you've gone to that historical period, and then you've had this administrative period and got them enrolled, then you have a stability period, or a stabilization period, which really is the established time during which the enrolled full-time employees are basically provided coverage. So you can review at the end of the stabilization period or stability period again and reevaluate where you're at, because that's still an estimate in that 3.5 look-back period. However, if you go to this kind of a safe harbor, this look-back safe harbor on the 3.5 months, then you can't look at it again. The stabilization period has to last at least 6 months on that employee count to make sure you're providing the proper coverage, if you will, and essential minimum value to your employees. So there is some examples here. We're not going to spend a lot of time on them because we don't have a lot of time left, but you have a 3-month standard period, might be August 15th to November 14th. Then you have the administrative period that's set here, and then you have a 6-month stability period. So the full-time employees is the required minimum at 6 months, like I said. Hours of service, let's move on to that real quick. Those are hours for which the employee is being paid or is entitled to receive payment from the employer for compensation as for personal services rendered. So if you have hourly employees, it's an actual physical hourly count. If it's salaried, then you can look at using the norms, which are 8 hours a day for 40 hours a week, and get to that kind of a calculation. There are a substantial number of special rules with respect to unpaid leaves of absence, rehired employees, and everything else. We really don't want to get into depth in a lot of that detail, but understand that there are a lot of nuances on this kind of stuff that you need to be somewhat familiar with to make sure you're fully in compliance. The issue then, we've gone through the discussion of what qualifies as an ALE, and then we've gone through what is the description of the employee count to get to the ALE status, and then we've talked about what the requirements are, the minimum coverage, and what was the other item?
Affordability.
Yeah, there you go, affordability. So now you have to look at what happens if you don't offer the affordability product and you don't meet the minimum value. Then you're running into a penalty situation. So
these penalties can be quite substantial. These are the famous, or the what we've all seen as the pay or play penalties. There are 2 different penalties depending on which part of the act is being violated. So we have offers, if an employer offers coverage to that 95% or the 70% for this current year, if the coverage is offered to fewer than those thresholds, but one full-time employee goes out and gets coverage from an exchange, then an employer is subject to this $2,000 level penalty. That is referred to as an A penalty, which comes from the code section of the ACA. That's 4980HA. So the employer would have to look on a monthly basis, look at 1/12 of 2,000 per full-time employee, regardless of whether or not all the employees have coverage through an exchange or not, per employee for the month, and then add that up across every month of the year. So that's $2,000 indexed for inflation. For the next year, I think it is $2,160, so that goes up slightly. There is a little reprieve that the number of total employees by month is reduced by 30. It's a formula, again, a formula-driven number. For 2015, part of the transition relief was to bring that number down to reduce it by 80. The second part of this penalty is if the employer does offer coverage to that 95% level or 70% level, but it does not meet the affordability or the minimum value tests, and an employee goes out and purchases subsidized coverage through an exchange. That penalty is $3,000 by every month that an employee goes out and receives that coverage. And that is calculated on an employee-by-employee basis for whether or not employees are getting subsidized coverage. I did want to note here that a full-time employee, we had mentioned full-time and full-time equivalent employees for calculating ALE status. A full-time employee is a true full-time employee. We don't bring in FTEs to this calculation.
Yeah, I think the salient thing about this, again, is that you have to appreciate. It's on an employee-by-employee basis, on a month-by-month basis. So the amount of accounting, the amount of administration that's in here is not insignificant. It's very substantial.
So how are employers going to pay this penalty? We're aware that on the individual side of things, the penalties or tax impact is felt when an individual files their tax return. For an employer, that's not the case. There is no tax return that an employer is going to file in order to pay these penalties. What's going to happen is that employers are going to be subject to the reporting requirements that take effect this year and in future years. So the employer is going to have to do some reporting. The health insurance providers are going to be reporting to the IRS on coverage that was provided to employees. Employees are going to be indicating on their tax returns their personal information. So once the IRS gathers all this information, which I'm not really sure how that process is truly going to work out. We all know how the IRS is with matching up and gathering information. Then the IRS is going to be notifying and sending out notices to the employers, assessing them of any tax for employees who should have been covered who weren't. Yes?
So from a practical standpoint, if you have less than 80 employees in 2015, you're really not going to pay any kind of penalty because of the reduction of the rate. So
Correct.
even though it's 50, you have less than 80 employees, you technically don't have to be penalized.
Not for 2015, as part of the transition relief. Or for any future year. That 30 employee reduction or that 80 employee reduction that's the part of the transition relief is formula driven, so that number is up to a maximum of 30 employees or 80 employees for this year. But that could be the case that you would hit that threshold and not have to pay. So the IRS is going to be sending out assessment notices. The employer does have the option and the ability to look through its records, to respond to the IRS assessment notice, and then the IRS will issue a final determination of any amount that's owed after that exchange has taken place. So this is not going to be a quick, easy, clean process.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I mean, the IRS is underfunded, undermanned, under-equipped with computers, and under-trained. So you put all that together and understand that the Internal Revenue Service is already handling the entire Internal Revenue Code and all the issues that have to do with excise and other revenues that are generated under the federal codes. You have a brewing nightmare here that we're going to be seeing a number of people getting notices that you're not even going to be able to interpret the notices initially. And then my expectation is that it will be some transition period, maybe 24, 36 months until things start coming out, trustworthy from the service, because they need time to acclimate to all of this. And they've taken good strides in moving forward. They really have. But again, the way the budgets have been cut over there, I think her comment, Rebekah's comment, is well founded that, to count on the Internal Revenue Service to be the person who's monitoring this is a little unfair. It's going to be a little unwieldy for them, which is basically going to make it unwieldy for all of you.
For what it's worth, there is a one-page flow chart in the materials. There's a website, the Kaiser Family Foundation, which we have referred to several times to pull some materials and some high-level references for flow charts, some practice tools. So there is a flow chart in your materials that could give you a kind of a walkthrough at a high level of being subject to these penalties or not.
In the time we have left, I want to talk a little bit about the reporting requirements, because that's been on everybody's mind and certainly a hot topic within the accounting community and the employer community, the benefits community. Beginning in 2016, as I said originally, if you are a qualifying ALE, then there's going to be reporting requirements regarding health care coverage that need to be filed this spring. And I guess, I said ALE, but that would be the most applicable, but really they're collecting data on all employers, on all employees.
On any employer that has 50 or more employees.
Right.
So any employer that meets the transition relief for being subject to the penalties in 2015 still is subject to reporting requirements for the 2015 year.
So again, as the slide says, it's going to be the IRS, that's enforcing this employer shared responsibility rules and the individual mandate per se. So the forms and instructions that have been issued by the date, we have a whole new collection of tax forms. So those of you that make a living in the tax departments, let's give you something to do in the spring. I know nobody's that busy. We have 1094Bs, Cs, 1095Bs, and 1095Cs, generally referred to as the B series and the C series in filing these forms. There's essentially two separate reporting requirements that are being dealt with here. One is the minimum essential health coverage. We've talked about that. It's generally referred to as the 6055 reporting requirement. Here, providers of minimum essential health coverage, that's the insurers, and in certain cases, sponsors of self-insured plans, they have to report to the IRS and covered individuals regarding health care coverage provided in 2015. So they as well need to do that. And then there's the employer shared responsibility reporting, again, referred to by Code Section 6056, where ALEs have to report to the IRS their full-time employees regarding coverage offered in 2015. And if you're a large self-insured type company, you're probably going to end up with both types of filing requirements that are there as well. So just real quick, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, that if the plan is insured, meaning you're buying the plan from an insurance company, then the insurance company is going to be responsible for the Bs, the 1094B and the 1095B. If it's a self-insured plan, as we said, then the employer is subject to the Employee Shared Responsibility Act, and the employer is eligible for combined reporting on 1094C and 1095C on the C collection. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean they have to file both forms, right? They can file one or the other.
That's correct. If we do have a self-funded employer, then they could do combined reporting on the 1095C and 1094C forms.
Yeah, now if you're an ALE and if the plan is self-insured and the employer is not subject to the shared responsibility rules, you still have to have essential health coverage reporting, which is going to flow over on the B's forms, the 1094B and the 1095B. So there's a lot of administration and a lot of filing. If you go to the next slide, I mean, we're talking about responsible entities, those that are subject to the shared responsibility rules that we've talked about. A Form 1095C has to be created for each full-time employee for any month of the year. So that's every employee is going to get a form. Form 1095C has to be provided to the employee on or before January 31st. Kind of follows the general information reporting rules under the Internal Revenue Code. C must also be provided, the 1094C, to the IRS, and then 1094C has to be filed with the IRS on or before February 28th. So there's a lot of administration that's going to get in here, and the offshoot of that is a need for, on your part, to have sufficient resources to be able to function through the administrative nightmare that this is going to become.
Yeah, and you know what, although there have been some transition reliefs for applicable large employers for that 50 to 99 mark, unfortunately there is no transition relief for these reporting requirements. There's no extension of due dates for this first year filing. Everything is due end of January and end of February. What we envision here is some major challenges in the data collection process for getting these forms filed. Through a payroll system that already exists, there would need to be additional fields and additional information collected and gathered through any of those systems, or new systems would have needed to be or will need to be implemented and put into place. So for in-house processing or for third-party processing, this is a major undertaking to bring all the information together for these different forms. And then, another challenge here is that the reporting is done on a calendar year basis, even if a plan is a fiscal year. Many health insurance plans are April to March or July to June. So that is also a consideration here to bifurcate or to pull apart that information. And then, as we already mentioned, that the mid-sized employers, 50 to 99 employees, companies with 50 to 99 employees are still required to report, even if they are not subject to the shared responsibility payments yet. There is some relief. This fourth bullet point here. I won't get into this too much. It's a pretty convoluted, simplified reporting availability to certain employers who are offering a very high level of coverage to their employees. And then, similar to other information reporting, for those employers that file 250 or more forms are required to file electronically. There are a few reporting penalties, a failure to file penalty and a failure to furnish penalty. The failure to file would be failing to file entirely, and failure to furnish would be failure to properly furnish and to properly complete those forms. That penalty is up to $100 per separate form and per employee. So there's a maximum. They're capped at $1.5 million for each failure to file and failure to furnish penalty. I think there would have to be an extremely high volume of forms not filed by an employer to reach those caps. But the IRS does recognize that this first year will be a transition period, so that they're going to have some leeway, or they'll allow some leeway for glitches in reporting, but not a complete failure to file. There is still a filing requirement.
We're not going to take time to explain the Cadillac tax. Understand it's a permanent excise tax, but it doesn't begin until 2018. So with a minute to go, we'll go through that next year. We'll touch real quickly on some of the considerations for small employers.
So although the majority of what we've talked about here today, this ALE determination and the shared responsibility payments aren't applicable to small employers, there are still some considerations that employers should take if they're small. For example, there is a credit still available to small employers who do provide health insurance to their employees. That has changed slightly since the ACA came into effect. It used to be available for a broad range of plans that was offered by a small employer. That has changed so that employers are only allowed to take that credit if they obtain their health insurance coverage for employees through a shop, an exchange, a marketplace exchange, not through a private insurer. And then just a variety. You know, small employers often do a variety or a mix of options for health insurance, including not offering coverage at all to any employees. And again, that's completely within their, discretion. There's no penalty imposed for not offering coverage, offering through a shop exchange, through a group, an insurance provider. So there are some things to consider for smaller employers.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, what you take away is that this is another substantial administrative function that the government is intervening in trying to, again, accomplish the goal of the ACA, which of course was to expand the number of Americans that are covered by qualified health care plans. It's not going to be easy, but it does seem to move towards accomplishing the goal overall. The problem is the administrative burden and the cost of this. We really haven't been able to find statistics on cost of compliance, but it's going to be substantial, and it's going to take time. Most people are pushing this out from accounting firms. I don't want to have a lot to do with this if I don't have to. We're pushing it out to payroll companies. A lot of the payroll service companies are offering this as kind of an add-on service. The ADPs and Paychecks and other companies like that are getting involved in handling this administration because they're already in the payroll records. So it's a functional application that seems to fit them better in their fields of expertise. So that concludes our session. Rebekah and I will be available after today's session. If you have an interest in asking us a question, you can call us or email us as well. We'll try to get you an answer.